you already know this place.
A line of white peaks against a hard blue sky. Prayer flags fraying in the wind. A trail of climbers roped together, moving toward the highest point on Earth. Nepal, the roof of the world. A box to tick on a traveler's checklist, a backdrop for someone's photograph. A place you pass through on the way to a summit. That picture is not wrong. 8 of the 14 tallest mountains on the planet stand inside this one small country. Everest is here. So is the trail that millions dream of walking. But that picture is the surface. And the surface is the least interesting thing about Nepal. Because below the peaks, in the valleys and the hill country and the lowland jungle, there are things here that no guidebook explains. Things the people who live beside them cannot fully explain either. There is a child in Kathmandu who is worshipped as a living goddess. No one can say with certainty when the tradition began or why. There is a language spoken in the Western Hills that belongs to no family on Earth. Not to the languages of India, not to the languages of Tibet, not to anything linguists have ever been able to connect it to. And there are men who climb 300 feet up a sheer cliff with no rope and no harness to take honey from the largest bee in the world. Honey that can make you hallucinate. Hold on to that language for a moment, the one that answers to nothing. We are going to come back to it at the very end, because it may be the strangest thing in this entire country. For now, only the question: what makes a place like this, old, layered, never conquered, keep so many things that even its own people cannot account for? Start with the land itself, because the land explains a great deal. Nepal is small. You could lose it inside a single large American state. And yet, packed into a strip of ground less than 200 kilometers deep, it stacks nearly every climate on Earth. Step off the high glaciers of the north, more than 8,000 meters up, and walk south. In a few days, you pass from permanent ice down through alpine meadow, into cloud forest, into terraced farmland, and out at last onto steaming tropical jungle barely above sea level. 8 worlds stacked on top of one another in the space most countries give to one. It is a land built, from the ground up, to keep many things separate and alive at the same time. To begin to answer the rest, you have to leave the mountains and come down into a valley. Kathmandu sits in a bowl in the hills, ringed by terraced slopes filled with temples. For most of its history, it was not one city but 3 kingdoms, each with its own palace square, its own carved wooden towers, its own line of god kings. The people who built it call themselves the Nuwa, and the Nuwa did something here that exists nowhere else. They made a goddess out of a girl. In a narrow brick house at the edge of the old palace square lives a child. She is usually no older than 5 or 6 when she begins. She wears red. Her eyes are ringed in black. Her feet are not allowed to touch the bare ground outside her house. She is the Kumari, the living goddess. And to both the Hindus and the Buddhists of this valley, she is not a symbol of a deity. She is the deity. Present, breathing, looking back at you from a carved window. The selection is exact. She must come from the Shakya clan, Nuwa Buddhists, the same lineage said to have produced the Buddha himself. She must have unblemished skin, unblemished eyes, a specific set of physical signs. and the process of finding her resembles almost exactly the way Tibetans search for the reincarnation of a lama. To Hindus, she holds the power of Taleju, a form of the great goddess Durga. To Buddhists, she is Vajradevi. One child, two religions, worshipped by both at the same time, in the same body, without contradiction.
And there is a final test.
On a night during the Great Autumn Festival of Dashain, the candidates are brought into a courtyard where the heads of sacrificed buffalo and goats lie in the candlelight, while masked men dance and make terrible sounds in the dark. A child who cries, who runs, who shows fear, is not the goddess. The true Kumari, it is said, sits through all of it unmoved, because the goddess inside her has seen far worse than this and is not frightened by death dressed up to scare a child. Here is what no one can quite explain. The legend says a king of the old Malla dynasty once played dice each night with the goddess Taleju until his pride drove her away, and that she returned only on the condition that she would live inside a chosen girl. It is a good story. It is also almost certainly not where the tradition really comes from. The truth is that nobody knows when this began. There are no records of the first Kumari, no founding date, no first name. The house she lives in was built in 1757. The tradition is plainly older than the house. Beyond that, the trail goes cold. A living institution, hundreds of years old, attended every single day, with no recorded beginning. And it has a cost. A Kumari serves until her body changes, until she bleeds for the first time, or loses blood from a wound, at which point the goddess is said to leave her, and she becomes an ordinary girl again. Then a new child is found, and the old one goes home. Imagine that. To be divine at 6, to be carried, never to walk in public, to have grown men bow to you for blessings, and then, one day, to be sent back to a normal house, a normal school, a normal life, expected to become a teenager as if none of it happened. Human rights lawyers in Nepal have called it what it looks like from outside: a childhood given up. A girl held apart from school, from friends, from the ordinary world in the name of culture. In 2008, the country's Supreme Court heard the argument and chose to let the tradition stand, citing its religious weight. Today, the government pays the living goddess a small stipend and guarantees her an education, a compromise between the modern state and a goddess it cannot quite bring itself to abolish. So what happens to a goddess when she grows up? Hold that question too. It does not have the answer you expect. The valley around her is dense with the sacred. Walk 20 minutes and you reach Buddhanath, a white dome the size of a small hill, painted with 2 enormous eyes that seem to follow you, one of the largest Buddhist stupas anywhere on earth. Walk the other way into the wood-carving city of Bhaktapur, and every wooden strut and window frame is alive with carved gods. Few people know how far the hands that made all this once reached. The Nuar of this valley were among the finest metalworkers and builders in Asia. In the 13th century, a young Nuar artist named Araniko led a team of craftsmen north into Tibet and then on to the court of Kublai Khan in China, where he is credited with carrying the multi-tiered pagoda style out of these hills and into the heart of the Chinese Empire. The temple roofs that the world thinks of as quintessentially Chinese may owe their shape to a man born in this small valley. The art did not stay home. It traveled the length of a continent and then quietly let everyone forget where it came from. All of it nearly ended on a single morning. April 25th, 2015. It is 11:56 in the late morning. The ground beneath the Kathmandu Valley begins to move and does not stop for 50 seconds. A magnitude 7.8 earthquake. Centuries-old temples that had stood through war and empire fold into their own foundations in front of crowds of people. Around 9,000 are killed across the country. The carved towers of the old palace squares come down in clouds of brick dust. But the brick house of the living goddess did not fall. When the dust cleared over Durbar Square, temples flattened on every side, the Kumari's home stood with only cracks in its walls. The child inside was unhurt.
You can read that however you want.
The faithful read it one way, an engineer would read it another. Both readings sit there side by side, and neither one cancels the other out. That is the texture of this whole country, the fact and the mystery holding the same space. To find where it all began, not the valley, but the faith that shaped half of it, you go south. Down out of the hills onto the flat green plain that runs along the border with India. This is the Terai, and in a quiet garden here beside a pool and an ancient pillar is the spot where, around 25 centuries ago, a queen is said to have stopped to rest and given birth to a son. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. The world would come to call him the Buddha. Here is the contradiction that lives at the center of Nepal. This is the birthplace of Buddhism, the literal ground where the Buddha entered the world. And yet Nepal, for almost all of its modern history, was not a Buddhist country at all. It was the last Hindu kingdom on earth, the only one, right up until 2008. A nation that gave the world its great teacher of detachment was ruled into living memory by a Hindu god-king with a crown and an army. Both things are true. The pilgrims still come to Lumbini, from Sri Lanka, from Thailand, from Japan, from every place the Buddha's words traveled. They walk past the marker stone, lay their offerings, sit in silence under the trees. And then they look up at the hills, toward a country that sent the teaching out into the world, and then for centuries mostly practiced something else. The Terai holds more than the Buddha's birthplace. To the east lies Janakpur, in the old epics, the kingdom where the goddess Sita was born, and where she married Rama, two of the central figures of all Hindu storytelling. The women of this region paint. For generations, they have covered the walls of their homes with bright, intricate Mithila paintings, fish and peacocks and gods rendered in red and ochre and indigo, a folk art made entirely by hand, passed from mother to daughter, with no school and no signature on any of it. Nepal does not resolve its contradictions, it simply keeps all of them. Hindu and Buddhist, mountain and jungle, the god-king and the goddess-child. It holds them the way the valley holds its temples, all at once, without choosing. Nowhere is that more visible than on the banks of a river in the capital, where the country does something with death that most of the world hides away. The Bagmati is a sacred river. On its western bank stands Pashupatinath, one of the holiest temples in the Hindu world, a temple to Shiva, lord of destruction and renewal. And along the river, on stone platforms at the water's edge, the dead of Kathmandu are burned in the open air. There is no wall around it, no screen. A body is wrapped in cloth, laid on a pyre of wood, and set alight, while the family watches and the smoke rises over the river. Strangers walk past on the far bank. Monkeys move through the temple grounds. Life and death share the same few square meters of riverbank in full view every single day. When the fire has done its work, the ashes are swept into the Bagmati, and the Bagmati flows south, out of Nepal, down onto the plains until it joins the Ganges, the holiest river in the Hindu world. So the dead of Kathmandu are carried, in the end, all the way to the sacred water of India, mingling there with the ashes of millions. A small mountain river doing the largest work there is. Among the temple's pillars sit the sadhus, holy men who have renounced everything. Ash-smeared, dreadlocked, wrapped in saffron, or in nothing at all. Some have held one arm raised over their head for so many years that it has withered in place. They have walked away from money, family, comfort, the future, to sit beside the river where the dead are burned and contemplate the one thing none of us escapes. The rest of the world treats death as something to be removed from sight, sterilized, kept behind doors. Here it is put at the center of the city, beside the holiest water, in the open, where children can see it, not as horror, as truth, as the most ordinary fact there is. Remember that. Death, made public, refused the dignity of being hidden. It comes back higher in the mountains, in a place where the dead are given not to fire, but to the sky. But Nepal is not only temple and ash. Drop further south, off the last of the hills, and the land turns to deep jungle. The Terai lowlands are hot, wet, and green, closer to the forests of India than to anything you imagine when you think of the Himalaya. And in the national park at Chitwan lives an animal that looks like it walked out of the age of the dinosaurs. The greater one-horned rhinoceros. Armor-plated, 2,000 kilograms, a single thick horn, skin folded into what looked like riveted steel plates. It moves through tall elephant grass and wallows in the rivers, sharing the forest with Bengal tigers, sloth bears, and gharial crocodiles with long, thin, fish-catching jaws. A century ago, these rhinos were nearly gone. Poaching and the clearing of the grasslands for farms cut their numbers to a few hundred. The horn, worth more by weight than gold in some markets, made every animal a target. And then the country did something difficult. It put soldiers in the forest. It made the killing of a rhino a serious crime, and it enforced it. Armed patrols, watchtowers, years of work. The rhino population stopped falling. Then it began to climb. Today, there are well over 700 greater one-horned rhinos in Nepal, brought back from the edge by a poor country that decided the animal was worth defending. That is the persistence theme of this place, written in flesh. Not a thing that survived by luck, a thing that survived because specific people with rifles and patience chose to keep it. And the forest has its own people. The Tharu have lived in the Terai so long that many of them carry a partial resistance to malaria in their blood, a quiet, biological adaptation to a jungle that killed almost everyone else who tried to settle it. For centuries, the lowland fever kept outsiders away, and the Tharu had the green world largely to themselves. They fished the rivers, farmed the clearings, and lived beside the tigers and the rhinos in a forest the hill people were afraid to enter. Now turn and climb. All the way up, past the tree line, into the high, cold country near the Tibetan border. The air thins. The color drains out of the land. And somewhere in that gray and white emptiness moves the animal almost no one ever sees. The snow leopard. A ghost, the color of stone and snow, with a tail nearly as long as its body, padded paws like snowshoes, fur thick enough to lie down in a blizzard. It hunts the blue sheep across slopes so steep that a falling animal can drop hundreds of meters. It can leap the length of a small bus. And it is so rarely glimpsed that herders who have spent their whole lives in these mountains may see one only a handful of times. It does not roar. It cannot. Its throat is built differently from the great cats of the lowlands. The most elusive predator in Asia moves through the highest mountains on Earth in near total silence. A few thousand of them scattered across a range that spans a dozen countries, each one holding a territory the size of a small nation. But the most famous inhabitants of these heights are not animals. They are people. High in the eastern mountains, in the shadow of Everest itself, live the Sherpa. They came over the passes from Tibet centuries ago and settled where almost nothing grows, at altitudes that leave outsiders gasping for breath. And over those centuries, their bodies changed. Sherpa blood carries genetic adaptations that let them use thin air more efficiently than lowlanders ever can. Their cells wasting less oxygen, their bodies shrugging off the altitude sickness that fells the very visitors they guide. They did not learn to live up here. They evolved to. When the world finally reached the summit of Everest, it did not do it alone. May 29, 1953, a New Zealand beekeeper named Edmund Hillary and a Sherpa named Tenzing Norgay stand together on the highest point on the surface of the Earth. Two men, one from the far side of the world, one born in the shadow of the mountain. They spend perhaps 15 minutes at the top, and then they climb back down, because no one can stay. Tenzing's name is remembered. Most are not. Every climbing season, Sherpa guides go up the mountain again and again, carrying loads, fixing ropes, crossing a river of shifting ice that can crack open without warning. They die on that mountain far more often than the foreigners who pay to be led up it. The summit the world dreams of standing on is built every single year on the backs of the people who were already here. And the mountain has only grown more crowded. On a rare clear day in the short climbing season, hundreds of people now queue along a single rope near the top, waiting their turn in air too thin to keep them alive, in a place the body begins to die just by standing in it. More than 300 people have died on Everest. Many are still up there, the cold holding them where they fell, too high and too dangerous to ever bring down. The dream at the top of the world is also, quietly, one of the highest graveyards on the planet. Not every mountain in this country is a graveyard. Down in a green valley beneath the Annapurna Range lies Pokhara, a lakeside town where the peaks reflect in still water, and the only thing falling from the sky is the occasional paraglider. It is the gentle face of the high country, the place travelers rest before and after the hard walking begins. The Sherpa, the snow leopard, the climbers, they share these heights with people who live by rules older than any of them. And one of the strangest of those lives in a walled town that until recently almost no outsider was allowed to enter. Beyond the Annapurna Range, in a high desert valley that drains toward Tibet, stands the old kingdom of Lo. Its capital, Lo Mantang, is a walled city of whitewashed mud brick, its great houses crowded against a single circuit of wall, a place that looks more like the Tibetan plateau than like anything south of the mountains. For centuries it was its own kingdom, with its own king, sitting astride the salt road between Tibet and the lowlands. Foreign travelers were kept out almost entirely until the 1990s. It had a king of its own right up until our own century. The salt that once made Lo rich, carried down from the Tibetan plateau on the backs of yaks and traded for lowland grain, lost its worth when cheap salt began arriving by truck from India, and the mountain kingdom slowly emptied of its purpose. Then, in 2008, when Nepal abolished its monarchy, it abolished his too. The last king of Lo, an old man in a walled town at the very edge of the country, lost his title in the same stroke that ended the God King down in Kathmandu. Two thrones, a world apart, switched off on the same day. In the cliffs around it are caves, thousands of them, cut high into vertical rock faces, many of them sealed for centuries. When explorers finally reached inside, they found ancient Buddhist paintings, manuscripts, and human remains, some thousands of years old. No one fully knows who dug them all, or how, or why so many. Whole apartment complexes of caves, hundreds of feet up a sheer wall, in one of the most remote valleys on Earth. Up here, the old high mountain way of death was the sky burial. The body returned not to fire, not to earth, but offered on a high place to the vultures, given back to the mountains that the living could never fully tame. A people too high for trees to grow, too far for the lowland customs to reach, who looked at death and made it a gift to the air. Death given to fire on the riverbank, death given to the sky on the cliff. The same country, the same refusal to look away, wearing two completely different faces, 3 days' journey apart. And on cliffs not so far from there, lower down where the rhododendron grows, men make a different kind of bargain with the mountains, not with death, with the largest bee in the world. On sheer rock faces in the central hills, the Himalayan giant honeybee, Apis laboriosa, builds its nests. A single bee is the length of the top joint of your finger, nearly 3 centimeters, the biggest honeybee on the planet. The combs hang from overhangs hundreds of feet above the valley floor, deliberately placed where almost nothing can reach them. Almost nothing. Twice a year, the Gurung and the Magar people of these hills go up after the honey. It is a craft passed down through generations, and it begins not with a ladder, but with a prayer. A shaman chooses an auspicious day. Offerings are made at the foot of the cliff, rice, flowers, a sacrificed animal, to ask the spirits of the rock for safe passage. Then a hunter climbs. He goes up a ladder of braided bamboo and hemp, sometimes 50, 60, 80 meters long, hung from the top of the cliff and held by nothing but his own weight and the team above. No harness, no rope around his body in the way you would imagine. Below him, 300 feet of empty air. Around him, tens of thousands of the world's largest bees, smoked into a fury, stinging through his thin clothing while he works a long pole to cut the comb free and lower it, dripping, into a waiting basket. And the honey itself is not ordinary honey. The giant bees feed in spring on the flowers of a particular rhododendron, flowers that carry a natural toxin called grayanotoxin. The bees are unharmed by it, but it passes unchanged into their honey. The result is what locals call mad honey, a substance that interferes with the nerves and the heart of anyone who eats it. In small amounts, it is medicine, an intoxicant, a thing worth more by weight than most people up here will earn in a month, selling in distant markets for hundreds of dollars a kilogram. In larger amounts, it slows the heartbeat, drops the blood pressure, and can kill. A red, bitter honey that heals, alters the mind, or stops a heart, depending only on the dose. It is dangerous work, and it is fading. The bees are fewer than they were, pressed by a warming climate, by pesticides drifting up the valleys, by the commercial buyers who now want more honey than the cliffs can give. And the hunters are fewer too. The young people leave for the cities, for the Gulf, for anywhere with a steadier wage than a man dangling on a burning ladder. In the high Hongu Valley, filmmakers once followed an aging hunter on what everyone understood would be his last climb. The last man in his village who truly knew the route up a particular cliff, the order of the handholds, the temper of those particular bees. When he stopped, that knowledge would not be written down anywhere. It would simply leave with him. Keep that man in mind, the last one who knew the way up, because he is not the only last one in this country, and the most important of them is still ahead of us. Further west, in the dry hills near the Indian border, there are people who never settled at all. The Raute are the last truly nomadic tribe in Nepal. A few hundred of them, no more, moving through the forests of the far west, the way their ancestors always have, building leaf and branch shelters, staying a few weeks, then dismantling everything and vanishing deeper into the trees. They do not farm. They hunt the langur monkeys of the forest, and they carve beautiful wooden bowls and boxes by hand, which they trade with settled villagers for grain. They refuse almost entirely to be drawn into the modern world. They resist being counted in the census. Many will not be photographed. They will not send their children to government schools or move into the houses the state has offered to build for them. They have watched every other forest people in Nepal give up the wandering life, and they have decided again and again not to. No one can quite explain why they hold on so completely when holding on costs them so much, when the forests shrink each year and the langurs grow scarce and the world presses in from every side. They are not preserved by a museum or a law. They persist by sheer refusal. A few hundred people who looked at everything modern Nepal offered them and walked back into the trees. And that refusal, quiet, stubborn, costly, turns out to be the oldest story this country tells about itself. Because Nepal, the country, has done the same thing the Raut do, on a national scale, for 300 years. Look at a map of South Asia in the 19th century, and almost all of it is colored for an empire. India, Burma, Sri Lanka, all under British rule, the whole subcontinent drawn and ruled from London, except for one ragged shape in the mountains that stays its own color. Nepal. It was never colonized, not by the British, not by the Mughals, not by anyone. Alone among the lands around it, it kept itself. You can read that independence in the smallest things. Nepal flies the only national flag on Earth that is not a rectangle. 2 stacked crimson triangles, a sun and a moon, a shape that matches no other country's because Nepal answered to no other country. And inside those borders, it kept not one people, but 100. More than 100 distinct ethnic groups, more than 120 living languages. A country the size of a single Indian state, holding more human variety than nations 10 times larger, because nothing ever flattened it into one. Not without blood. In 1814, the kingdom went to war with the British East India Company, and after 2 hard years of fighting in the hills, it lost. The Treaty of Sugauli in 1816 shrank Nepal's borders to roughly what they are today. But it did not make Nepal a colony. The hill soldiers had fought so fiercely that the British chose, in the end, not to swallow the country, but to keep it as a buffer between their India and the Empire of China to the north, and to recruit those same soldiers into their own army. Those are the Gurkhas, hillmen from Nepal who have fought under the British flag since that war more than 2 centuries ago, with a reputation so fearsome that their name alone became a kind of warning. They carry a curved knife called the kukri, heavy and forward bent, and there is an old saying among them that once it is drawn, it should not be sheathed again until it has drawn blood. Their motto: better to die than live a coward. They are, even now, a salaried part of the British Army, soldiers of a country that was never conquered, serving the empire that could not conquer it. But here is the part the outside world usually gets wrong. We tell the story of Nepal's independence as a triumph, the brave little kingdom that beat the empires. And it is true that they were never ruled from outside. What that story leaves out is the price of staying free. After the war with Britain, Nepal did not fling its doors open in confidence. It did the opposite. It shut itself. For more than 100 years, through the entire age of the railway, the telegraph, the modern world remaking everything around it, Nepal sealed its borders and turned inward, ruled by a single family of hereditary prime ministers who kept the king as a figurehead and the country as a locked room. It was never conquered. But for a century, to stay unconquered, it chose to disappear. The doors did not reopen until 1951, a place that kept its freedom by refusing the world, and then had to learn, very fast and very late, how to live in it.
Hold that one too.
The country that was never taken, that kept itself by closing. It is going to matter at the very end, when a generation decides to tear the locked room open from the inside. But first, the strangest thing in Nepal, the thing I asked you to remember at the very beginning. Go back to the western hills, not to the high snow, not to the jungle, but to the ordinary green middle country. Terraced fields, scattered villages, the districts of Rolpa and Dang, and the hills around them. There is nothing here that looks remarkable, and yet somewhere in these hills lives a person who carries something that exists nowhere else on the planet. The Kusunda. A tiny people, only a couple of hundred now identify as Kusunda at all. For most of history, they were forest nomads, hunter-gatherers who moved through the western woods and called themselves, in their own tongue, the kings of the forest. They hunted with bow and snare, traded wild meat and honey with the farmers below, and married, slowly, into the settled world until almost nothing of the old life was left. Almost nothing, except the language. And the Kusunda language is one of the genuine puzzles of human speech, because it is a language isolate. That means it has no known relatives anywhere on Earth, not one. Think about what that means. Nepal sits exactly where two of the world's great language families meet. From the south and west came the Indo-Aryan tongues, Nepali, Hindi, the languages of India. From the north and east came the Sino-Tibetan tongues, Tibetan, Tamang, Newari. Every other language in the region belongs to one family or the other. They have cousins. They have ancestors you can trace. Kusunda belongs to neither. It cannot be connected to the languages of India. It cannot be connected to the languages of Tibet. It cannot be connected to anything, not Basque, not Korean, not any of the other lonely isolates scattered across the world. It stands completely alone. Its sounds are unlike its neighbors. Its grammar follows rules that don't behave like the rules of the languages all around it. The first British official to write any of it down, back in the 1840s, could barely get near the speakers. They were that reclusive, that few. He gathered a couple hundred words second-hand through intermediaries because he could not reach the Kusunda directly at all. For a long time afterward, scholars assumed it was simply a strange branch of the Tibetan languages, because what else could it be? And the closer anyone looked, the stranger it became. Its words for the most basic things, water, fire, the sun, match neither the languages of India to the south nor the languages of Tibet to the north. It builds its sentences on a foundation no one has been able to place. The harder linguists tried to file it under some known family, the more it refused. In the end, they had to admit the truth. It does not belong to any family at all. It is its own and only branch. Then, in 2004, 3 Kusunda were brought to Kathmandu to sort out citizenship papers. And at the university, linguists realized that one of them, a woman named Gyani Maya Sen, was a fluent speaker of a language they thought was already as good as dead. The ghost had a voice. And what that voice carried was, most likely, a fossil. The leading idea is that Kusunda is the last surviving trace of a far older world, the speech of the hunter-gatherers who lived across these mountains before the great farming peoples arrived, before the Tibetans came down from the north and the Indo-Aryans came up from the plains. Those first peoples were absorbed, displaced, married away until their languages vanished one by one. And Kusunda is the only one that, by some accident of isolation in these particular hills, did not. A single thread left from a tapestry that has otherwise completely unraveled. The voice of the people who were here first. Gyani Maya Sen spent her last years fighting to save it. She helped record words, ran classes, tried to pass the grammar to anyone who would sit and learn. She died in 2020, and with her went the deepest well of the language. The numbers tell the story without mercy. In the national census, barely 250 people now claim Kusunda identity at all, and that figure slips a little lower with each count. Of those, almost none can speak more than a scattering of words. The government has begun paying a small stipend to anyone who registers as Kusunda, hoping to draw people back to a heritage they had once learned to hide, taking the names of other castes to escape it. The money has brought a few of them home to the name. It cannot bring back the fluency. Today there is, by most counts, a single fluent native speaker of Kusunda left alive, Gyani Maya's relative, an aging woman, carrying in her own mind the entire surviving grammar of a tongue with no rulebook, no relatives, and no one fully fluent to answer her in it. She speaks Nepali all day, like everyone around her. The old language lives now mostly in recordings, in the notes of linguists, in classes where the young learn fragments they will probably never speak at home. Remember the honey hunter, the last man who knew the way up a particular cliff, whose knowledge would simply leave with him because it was written nowhere else? This is the same thing, raised to its highest possible form. A whole language, a whole way of cutting the world into words, held in one human memory. When that memory goes, a door that has stood open since before history closes, and no one, not the speaker herself, not the linguists, not anyone alive, can fully explain where the language came from, who its people really were, or why, of all the tongues that died in these hills, this one alone survived to be the last. That is what the title of this film promised you, a place mysterious even to the people who live in it. Here it is, in a quiet house in the Western Hills. Not a legend, not a tourist's mystery, a real, unanswered question sitting in the mind of one elderly woman running out of time. You can save a building. You can guard a rhino with rifles. You can rebuild a temple from its own fallen bricks. But you cannot, in the end, force a living language to keep living. It needs a child to want it. And the children, mostly, want the world. We began with a question. What makes a place keep so many things it cannot explain? And the answer, walking back through everything we've seen, is something like this. Nepal never had its memory erased. It was never conquered, never made to forget itself, never ruled long enough by anyone else to be remade in their image. And so it kept everything. The goddess with no founding date, the honeycraft passed down by prayer, the cave cities and the sky burials, the last nomads, the last speaker. A country that held on to all of it, the explained and the unexplainable, because no one ever made it let go. But holding on is not the same as being safe. The monarchy that held the country whole for centuries did not end quietly. June 1st, 2001. Inside the royal palace in Kathmandu, the family gathers for an evening meal. By the end of the night, the king, the queen, and most of the royal household are dead. Shot, the official inquiry concludes, by the crown prince himself, who then turns the weapon on his own head. In a single evening, almost the entire royal line is wiped out. The country wakes to a massacre it still argues about today, whispered conspiracies, an official report few fully believe, a wound in the heart of the monarchy that never closed. And the throne was already shaking. For 10 years, from 1996, a Maoist insurgency had been burning through the countryside, and it had begun in exactly the western hills we have been walking through. Rolpa, the same district where the Kusunda still hold their language. By the time the war ended in 2006, around 17,000 people were dead. 2 years later, in 2008, the monarchy was abolished altogether. The world's last Hindu kingdom became a republic. The God King was simply gone. But what replaced him did not bring calm. In the years that followed, government after government rose and fell. Coalitions collapsed. Prime ministers cycled through, one after another, while corruption settled into the bones of the new democracy, and a whole generation grew up watching it and quietly packing their bags for jobs in foreign countries because there was nothing for them at home. And then the locked room finally cracked open. Not from outside, but from within. September 2025. The streets of Kathmandu fill with young people. They are angry about corruption they have watched their whole lives, about leaders who grow rich while they themselves must leave the country to find work, about a government that has just tried to shut down their social media. And in a matter of days, it becomes the largest uprising the country has seen in a generation. The protests turn violent. Buildings burn. The parliament, the homes of politicians, more than 2,000 structures in all. In the chaos, the prisons break open and thousands of inmates walk free. 76 people are killed. The Prime Minister resigns. And in the wreckage, this generation does something almost no one has ever done. They choose their interim leader by vote on a messaging app, gathering by the tens of thousands in an online chat to nominate her. And they choose a woman, a former Chief Justice, the first woman ever to lead Nepal. Months later, in the spring of 2026, the country holds a fresh election, and the people hand power to an outsider, a former rap musician who had become mayor of Kathmandu, swept in on the votes of the young. Think about what that means against everything we have seen. For 300 years, this country protected itself by closing, sealing its borders, holding its traditions, refusing the world's hand. And now, its youngest citizens have done the opposite. They have torn the room open. They are connected to everything, everywhere, all at once. They are not interested in disappearing to stay safe. So the real question Nepal faces now is not whether it can survive the world. It already proved across 3 centuries that it can. The question is the harder one, the one the honey hunter and the last speaker both pose in their separate, quiet ways. When a generation finally throws the doors open, connects to everything, wants the whole modern world, what happens to the things that only survived because the doors were shut? Will the new Nepal keep the living goddess, or decide a child cannot be a deity? Will it keep the honeycraft, or let the last cliff root die with the last old man? Will it find a way to hand the Kusunda language to a child who actually wants it, or will it let the king of the forests fall silent at last, in a country too busy becoming new to notice? No one knows. That is the honest answer. The mysteries that survived because Nepal stood still are now in the hands of the most restless generation it has ever produced. And there is one small thread that holds both things at once, the old and the new, the unexplained and the rushing future. In October of 2025, in the middle of all that upheaval, life in the valley did not stop for the goddess. A toddler, barely 2 years old, was carried in her father's arms across the old palace square, past the cracks the earthquake had left, and installed as the new living goddess of Kathmandu. The same impossible tradition. No founding date, no clear reason, hundreds of years deep. Carried on by hand across a square. In the same week, the country was tearing itself apart and remaking itself in front of the world. A 2-year-old goddess in a country run by a rapper, in a kingdom that is no longer a kingdom, that was never conquered, that keeps a language no one on earth can place. All of it, at the same time, without choosing. That is Nepal. Not the mountains. The mountains were only ever the wall around it. What had guarded behind that wall, the goddess and the ghost language, the cliff honey and the open pyres, the cave cities and the kings of the forest. Those are the real summit. And whether they survive the next 30 years depends entirely on whether anyone young enough to matter decides they are worth keeping. Some of them will be, some of them won't. And the people of this place will go on doing what they have always done, holding everything all at once and explaining none of it. High in the eastern forests, where the bamboo grows beneath the rhododendron, something small and red moves through the branches. The red panda. Not a bear, not a raccoon, not quite anything else. The only living member of its own small family. Another isolate, this one made of flesh instead of words. It sleeps in the high canopy, eats almost nothing but bamboo, and grows scarcer every year as its forest is cut. Few people ever see one. It asks nothing of the world except to be left its trees. It is, in its way, the whole country in miniature. Rare, alone in its lineage, quietly holding on in the high forest while everything below it changes. Whether it is still here in 50 years depends, like the language, like the goddess, like the honey on the cliff, on whether anyone decides it is worth the trouble of keeping. Take a breath. Stay a while. The roof of the world has more underneath it than you were ever told. Thanks for watching. Until the next journey.